At number 10, Roberto, Josu, Vieira, Abar. In 2019, an employee at the Davidson County Sheriff's Office in Tennessee accidentally consolidated an inmate's unresolved first-degree murder charge with some far less serious probation violation charges he was also being held on. When 26-year-old Roberto Josu Vieira Abar finished serving his time for violating probation, the murder charge was no longer visible in his file and he was released. Vieira Abar was one of 3 men charged with the murder in the 2017 shooting death of 26-year-old Luis Lopez, whose partially burned remains were discovered in a garbage bag in a wooded area. The suspects and the victim were friends, according to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, but the agency declined to reveal much else about the case. After being released in error, Vieira Abar turned himself in. In a statement, Sheriff Darren Hall said that there was no excuse for the mistake that resulted in the suspect being freed, and he reassured the public that the employee responsible would be disciplined. Vieira Abar was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and released in 2021 after serving just 30% of a 6-year prison sentence. Just months later, he wound up back in police custody for allegedly breaking into a Nashville home and setting at least 4 fires inside. He's currently serving a 3-year prison sentence for aggravated burglary and arson. Number 9, Noah Edwards. Staff members at the Adult Detention Center in Indianapolis were tasked with releasing inmate named Noah Edwards, who had completed his sentence for drug and gun-related charges in 2022. But they accidentally released an accused killer with a similar name, Noah Edwards. It was a mix-up that could have been prevented if proper protocol had been followed. Noah Edwards is one of 3 suspects who are accused of luring 32-year-old Sheridan Tom into an abandoned home and shooting him during a robbery several months earlier. Luckily, the mistakenly freed fugitive was recaptured and taken back to jail 11 hours later. Marion County Sheriff Kerry Forrestal launched an investigation into the incident and fired a deputy for failing to review and verify that he was releasing the correct inmate. The victim's loved ones were understandably outraged by the error. Speaking to the Indy Star, Sheridan Tom's sister, Raven Krzyzewski, said that it was unfair for Edwards to experience life outside jail when her brother no longer gets to experience life at all. She called for improved measures to ensure that the suspects remained behind bars. At number 8, Christopher Buggs. 26-year-old Christopher Buggs was awaiting trial for murder in 2021 while also serving a 30-day sentence for an unrelated criminal contempt case at Rikers Island in New York City. A paperwork error listed the 30-day sentence as the final disposition of his murder charge, and he was freed accordingly. Authorities announced that a manhunt was underway along with an investigation into how the clerical mix-up happened. The mistake was reported to the NYPD 12 hours after Buggs caught a bus out of Rikers, and 4 employees were suspended without pay. Buggs was captured over a month later while browsing the Little Debbie snacks at a bodega in the Bronx and was immediately taken back to Rikers. The NYPD declined to discuss how they tracked the fugitive down. In the meantime, then-Mayor Bill de Blasio vowed to implement new measures to prevent the jail from accidentally freeing a murder suspect ever again. Buggs was accused of fatally shooting 55-year-old Ernest Brownlee during a dispute outside a Brooklyn bodega in 2018. He was already being held for second-degree murder when he was charged with contempt for screaming at a judge in a viral, profanity-laden rant. The paperwork error resulting in his release happened sometime after that. Brownlee's widow, Winifred Mackins, was understandably outraged by the mistake. Thankfully, he was back behind bars after 5 weeks of freedom. Number 7, Jeremy William Bennett. Jeremy William Bennett was sentenced to 28 years in prison after pleading guilty to murder in 2015. 2 years earlier, he and another young man named Andrew Boyd shot 54-year-old father of 2, Larry House. They shot him inside the parking garage of a Tacoma, Washington apartment building during a robbery gone wrong. Because Bennett was just 17 years old at the time of the crime, he petitioned the court to reconsider his sentence and won a new sentencing hearing in 2022. As a result, the young convict's sentence was labeled as vacated and he was freed. But this was done in error, and Pierce County Deputy Prosecutor Bryce Nelson was the first person to catch on to the mistake when he received an alert about Bennett's release through the state's notification system. Nelson contacted the State Department of Corrections, local law enforcement, the U.S. Marshal Service, and Bennett's lawyer. Bennett turned himself in with his attorney a little while later. He and his parents reportedly told jail staff that he was being released by mistake, but said that the employees let him go anyway. The status of his resentencing is unclear. Number 6. Garrett Oliver. 29-year-old Garrett Oliver was being held at the Cook County Jail in Chicago for armed robbery in 2015 when authorities charged him with murder in an unrelated case dating back to 2012. He was convicted of armed robbery in 2017 and received a 4-year prison sentence while still awaiting trial for the murder charge. Employees at the prison intake center determined that Glover had served enough time to satisfy the 4-year sentence. Instead of sending him back to the Cook County Jail for the pending murder charge, where 2 other suspects in the case were being held without bond, they released him. By the time a prosecutor discovered the mistake a few days later, Glover had slipped out of sight and gone into hiding. An Illinois Department of Corrections spokesperson said that the agency never received paperwork regarding anything other than Glover's armed robbery or any other indicators that he should have been returned to Cook County custody. In the meantime, Cook County Sheriff's Office spokesperson Kara Smith said that they weren't focused on allocating blame at the moment, but their priority was to find Glover and put him back in jail. Most of the finger-pointing came after the fugitive was discovered sleeping on the floor of a relative's apartment in suburban Atlanta, 750 miles away from Chicago, and more than a month after he fled from justice. While the outcome of Glover's murder case is still unclear, he was reportedly killed in a shootout in Markham, Illinois in 2020. Number 5. Charles Walker and Joseph Jenkins. Florida authorities were baffled when convicted killers Charles Walker and Joseph Jenkins somehow obtained forged paperwork that reduced their life sentences to 15 years and walked free from a Franklin County prison in 2013. Jenkins was behind bars for killing an Orlando man in 1998 and was mistakenly released about a week before Walker, who was serving time for a murder he committed in 1999. Freedom was supposed to be nowhere in sight for either man when they pulled off the scheme, but the fake documents were very convincing. Jenkins initially traveled to Orlando, where he registered as a released felon as required by law for actual released felons. He once again slipped under the radar in plain sight, unnoticed by the law enforcement employees who processed his registry. Walker did the same thing, and both men visited their families before going on the run together. After receiving a notice about Jenkins' release, one of his victims' relatives contacted prosecutors and asked them to review the decision, at which point they realized that Walker and Jenkins had cleverly weaseled their way out of prison. Their loved ones were totally unaware that they had been released fraudulently and simply thought the men had miraculously managed to get their sentences reduced. When they found out the truth, they went on the news and urged the fugitives to turn themselves in. But the convicts had no plans to do so and received help from others, including someone who picked them up and rented them a hotel room in Panama City Beach on the Panhandle coast. They were out for no more than a few weeks before they were recaptured and sent straight back to the penitentiary. But there's no telling how long they would have gone unnoticed if the family member of one of their victims hadn't raised the alarm. Authorities suspected that Walker and Jenkins worked with at least 4 co-conspirators, including a former inmate on the outside, to create the false documents and deliver them to the Orange County Clerk's office. Nobody there noticed that the case numbers on the paperwork were false or that the judge's signature was forged. Needless to say, the state's Department of Corrections changed the way they handle early release paperwork. Number 4. Stone Colburn. In 2021, authorities in Loudoun County, Virginia, charged 23-year-old Stone Colburn with the murder of his brother's girlfriend, 24-year-old Natalie Crow. A mental evaluation found him incompetent to stand trial, and the case was put on hold while the judge overseeing the case sent him to a state hospital to see if his condition improved. Concerned that Colburn might be faking his condition, prosecutors asked the judge for a second evaluation in 2022. In the meantime, Colburn's attorney hoped that the judge would find the young man incapable of being restored to sanity, which would require him to spend at least 5 years in a mental institution. The judge denied the request for a second evaluation, so prosecutors used a rare legal technique and moved to dismiss the murder case against Colburn while filing a new charge for concealing a dead body. The change would get the case moved to a different court, and the new charge was supposed to keep Colburn in custody while prosecutors worked through the complicated situation. But it was somehow released due to the confusion over the paperwork among jail staff, despite the prosecutors' best efforts to ensure that this wouldn't happen. Colburn was arrested the following evening in Chatham County, Georgia, and was transported back to Virginia. Number 3. Cornell Gray. 22-year-old Cornell Gray was being held on suspicion of aggravated murder at the Cuyahoga County Jail in Ohio when he was unexpectedly set free in early 2022. Nobody really knew how it happened, but the murder charge was never entered into the jail's computer system, and Gray was released on bond for an unrelated weapons charge. It was the second time in 3 years that a murder suspect was erroneously released from the facility. Gray is accused of shooting Marvin Keith 4 times outside the victim's home in Cleveland in 2021. Keith was rushed to the hospital where he died from his injuries. Authorities never revealed what they believe led up to the shooting or how they identified Gray as their prime suspect. U.S. Marshals arrested Gray in Houston, Texas, after a months-long investigation and manhunt. He was released from custody shortly after being extradited to Ohio. Gray was apprehended more than 3 weeks later in Lawrence, Indiana, outside Indianapolis. Number 2. Rodriguez Pernell. 30-year-old Rodriguez Pernell was waiting to go on trial for first-degree murder in Baltimore, Maryland, when he was mistakenly released from jail in 2014. Pernell was being held in connection with the 2013 shooting death of a 27-year-old TJ Rubottom after his first trial ended in a hung jury. He was recharged, but corrections officer confused his new case with the one that had been closed out and freed him. To make matters worse, the jail staff didn't even notice. They were informed of the mistake by the victim's family, who heard that Pernell was seen hanging out in their neighborhood and called the facility. Rubottom's mother, Jackie Davis, told ABC News that she feared for her family's safety and for the safety of witnesses in the case when she found out that the suspect was back out on the streets. She summed up her thoughts into a simple statement: "This should have never happened." Police recaptured Pernell just blocks away from the scene of Rubottom's murder nearly a week after he was released, and he was returned to jail. A statement from the Maryland Department of Public Safety and Corrections blamed the mix-up on a lapse in release procedures that would otherwise have identified the pending charges at the time of release. An employee was put on paid leave pending the outcome of an investigation. Pernell was found guilty of first-degree murder and 2 gun-related crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison. And at number 1, Stephen Manzo. Murder suspect Stephen Manzo was arrested in 2020 in connection with the fatal shooting of a Long Beach, California man 2 years earlier. In early 2021, he was mistakenly released from the downtown Los Angeles jail where he was awaiting trial. Prosecutors and law enforcement agencies were quick to point the finger at one another for letting a suspected killer walk free. According to an LA County Sheriff's Department spokesperson, the agency received an order to release Manzo, citing the dismissal of his case, and complied with the order accordingly. As it turns out, the case against Manzo had been dismissed when he wasn't transported to court as scheduled, but all 5 charges were immediately refiled under a different case number. Under the new case, he was ordered remanded pending an arraignment, but someone clearly didn't get that part of the memo, and Manzo was released. A nearly 2-week-long multi-agency manhunt ensued before the 24-year-old was spotted getting into a vehicle and taken back into custody during a traffic stop. His bail was set at over $4 million.
Number 9. Gemma Mitchell. 67-year-old Mi Quen Chong, who went by the nickname Deborah, initially agreed to lend £200,000 to her friend from church for home repairs. The friend was 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell, but Deborah changed her mind and urged Mitchell to sell the house in northwest London, which was in a state of disrepair but worth around £4 million. At the time, Deborah had her own problems to deal with. Her mental health was declining, and she reportedly suffered from schizophrenia. As Mitchell continued to pressure her to hand over the money for repairs, she put her foot down and made it clear that she wasn't going to help. Not wanting to take no for an answer, Mitchell went to Deborah's home one day in 2021 and bludgeoned her to death. She then dismembered the body and was seen wheeling them out of Deborah's home in 2 suitcases. Mitchell dumped the victim's headless remains more than 200 miles away in Devon, where they were discovered by vacationers the next day. In the meantime, she falsely reported Deborah missing and created a forged copy of her will, listing herself as the heir to almost all of the woman's £700,000 estate. But Mitchell never saw that money. Instead, she was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 34 years. Number 8. Cadin Costoff. In 2016, 38-year-old Gergana Prodanova vanished in Exeter, England from the home she shared with her partner, 42-year-old Cadin Costoff. Her concerned co-workers called the police when she failed to show up for work. Costoff told investigators that Gergana's mother had just died and that she was in Bulgaria for the funeral. 4 weeks later, a railroad worker found the woman's dismembered remains inside a suitcase next to some train tracks. An investigation uncovered surveillance footage of Costoff rolling the suitcase through Exeter city center 3 days after Gergana disappeared. In the video, he can be seen pausing several times to catch his breath. Evidence revealed that Gergana wanted to end their 15-year relationship shortly before she died. She had met someone new, but Costoff refused to let her leave him and move out. The night she went missing, her new partner received a text from her phone stating that she was about to catch a flight to Bulgaria. Based on the wording, he suspected that someone else had written the message. His suspicions were confirmed when a forensic phone analysis revealed that Costoff sent the texts after murdering Gergana. Costoff maintained his innocence despite the mounting evidence against him. He even tried to appeal the case after being convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, arguing that the case was flimsy and unfair. But the court upheld the ruling, pointing out its decision that the evidence against Costoff was overwhelming. He will serve at least 19 years before he's eligible for parole. Number 7. Jesse Shane Kempson. In a case that made international news headlines, British tourist Gracie Mullane disappeared during a trip to Auckland, New Zealand in 2018. She had recently graduated from college and arrived in New Zealand after spending some time in South America. Her plan was to stay for 2 weeks, but she didn't even get to spend a full day there before she met with foul play. Grace's parents knew something was wrong when she didn't respond to her birthday wishes. They reported her missing. Detectives soon discovered that the young woman was last seen alive at a hotel on the first day of her trip with a man named Jesse Shane Kempson. After meeting with Grace, Kempson was seen rolling 2 suitcases out of the hotel. Her murdered remains were found buried in one of the suitcases in the Waitakere Mountains 9 days after she vanished. A medical examiner determined that she was strangled to death. Kempson argued in court that Grace's death was accidental and that it happened when they got too rough in the bedroom. During his trial, another woman who had met him on Tinder before the murder told the court that Kempson expressed a concerning interest in violent intimacy. She said that he seemed sympathetic toward a man who was arrested for suffocating his girlfriend during the act. She also said he mentioned that police were overwhelmed by the number of bodies that were appearing in the area where Gracie's remains were found. Kempson denied the allegations, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 17 years. The court denied his appeal. Number 6. Brian Jones. In 2022, a 62-year-old truck driver named Brian Jones entered the police station in Bessemer, Alabama, and confessed to killing his girlfriend and dumping her remains in the woods 21 years earlier. He explained that he was coming forward because he didn't want to disappoint his parents, who died in 2020, and led officers to a green suitcase filled with human bones. The victim was identified as Janet Luxford, who disappeared in 2001 while working at a hotel in Jacksonville, Florida. Jones said that Janet wanted to travel to California to see family members and asked him for money. He erupted into a fit of rage and bludgeoned her in the throat with a golf club. Janet had a history of addiction. When her family stopped hearing from her, they reportedly assumed she had fallen back into old habits and abandoned her responsibilities, including a 12-year-old daughter. She wasn't listed as missing until a year and a half after her disappearance, and no major investigations appear to have taken place in an effort to find her. Bessemer Police Lieutenant Christian Clemens told local station WBRC that because Janet's last known whereabouts were in Florida, the homicide wasn't even on the department's radar when Jones turned himself in. He described Jones' sudden confession as a once-in-a-career type situation. Jones was charged with murder and abuse of a corpse. His case is ongoing. Number 5. Stephen Zelich. Mother of 7 Laura Simonson disappeared in 2013 after leaving her home in Farmingdale, Minnesota to meet up with a man she was talking to online. She was never seen again. Police identified the man as 52-year-old Stephen Zelich, a former police officer from Wisconsin. Zelich resigned from his job 12 years earlier after a terrified prostitute was seen fleeing from his house naked. Zelich told detectives that he met with Simonson at a hotel and that she was alive and well when they parted ways. An investigation revealed that he spent a lot of time on BDSM websites where he went by the name Mr. Handcuffs and advertised himself as a master in search of a slave. But most members of the BDSM community aren't violent killers, and while he remained law enforcement's prime suspect, it wasn't enough to suggest that Zelich was involved in Simonson's disappearance. In June of 2014, a worker discovered 2 suitcases containing the remains of 2 deceased individuals while mowing the grass along a roadside in Geneva, Wisconsin. One of the victims was identified as Laura Simonson, and the other was a 19-year-old woman named Jenny Gomez, who vanished from Oregon in 2012. Surveillance footage from the hotel where Zelich and Simonson met showed the pair checking in together, but Simonson was never seen leaving. The video showed Zelich pulling a luggage cart out of the hotel alone. He claimed that he killed Simonson and Gomez by accident during a choking game, but the court didn't buy it. Zelich was convicted of murdering both women and hiding their corpses, and received sentences of 35 years, 25 years, and 10 years, which will keep him behind bars or life. Number 4. Michael Lee Dudley. While creating a TikTok video on a remote Seattle beach in 2020, a group of teenagers spotted a small black suitcase in the water. They curiously approached it and joked around about what might be inside, with one person commenting on how they hoped the luggage was filled with money. As the kids pried the suitcase open with a stick, they were overwhelmed with a foul odor. Suspecting they had found human remains, they dialed 911. Responding officers soon confirmed that the luggage and several other bags they found in the area contained dismembered body parts. The remains were identified as 35-year-old Jessica Lewis and 27-year-old Austin Wenner. A medical examiner determined that they had died about a month earlier from multiple gunshot wounds. Before their murders, the couple were renting a room from a landlord named Michael Lee Dudley. They fell behind on rent, and it led to a huge blowout between the two parties. Neighbors recalled hearing a man pleading one night, saying, "Please don't do this. Please just let me leave." Moments later, they heard gunshots. Locals called police, but Dudley didn't answer the door when officers arrived, so they simply left. It was sadly probably too late to save Lewis and Wenner's lives by then. Court documents obtained by local station K5 News revealed that the cuts on the body parts were disorganized and appeared to be made with different tools, suggesting that someone helped Dudley dismember the victims. He was charged with 2 counts of intentional homicide, and the case is ongoing. Number 3. Thomas Nutt. Just days before her wedding in 2021, 52-year-old Dawn Walker told her daughter that she had a feeling something bad might happen to her. Her relationship with 45-year-old Thomas Nutt had a tumultuous past, including previous allegations of abuse that had landed Nutt in jail. But she married him anyway. Nobody ever saw or heard from her again. 4 days after the wedding, Dawn's body was found stuffed in a suitcase behind some bushes outside the couple's home in West Yorkshire, England. By then, Nutt reported her missing, blaming her disappearance on her mental health. He also sent her loved ones texts, pretending to be her, and joined them on a search for her. Investigators learned that Nunn murdered Dawn during an argument just hours after they got married. He stuffed her body in a cupboard, then went on to the couple's planned honeymoon alone. When he returned, he put her in the suitcase and dumped it outside. Nutt claimed that he killed his bride by accident, telling police that Dawn had made false allegations of abuse against him in the past and was threatening to do so again. He said that she was threatening to divorce him and was suffering from symptoms of bipolar disorder. At some point during the argument, Nutt snapped and hit his wife, but he swore he didn't mean to kill her. He admitted to manslaughter in court, but denied the murder charge against him. The couple's volatile past revealed a disturbing pattern of abuse, making Nutt's claims doubtful at best. Dawn's family described how Nutt isolated her from them for years while he manipulated and controlled her. A former neighbor recalled hearing Dawn screaming from inside the couple's home one day about a year before the murder. When they went to see what was wrong, Nutt told them Dawn was having a panic attack, at which point she yelled not to believe him and that he was trying to kill her. Nutt was convicted of murder and sentenced to life with a minimum of 21 years. Number 2. Melanie Maguire. In May 2004, 3 suitcases containing human body parts washed ashore along the Chesapeake Bay. The remains were identified as a computer programmer and father of 2 from New Jersey named Bill Maguire, who was last seen alive a few weeks earlier. Bill's wife, Melanie, told detectives that her husband stormed out of the house during an argument. She never saw him again. An investigation turned up evidence of a deeply troubled marriage. Melanie had been having an affair for quite some time, and someone had used the family's computer to search for things like how to commit a murder. Just days before Bill disappeared, Melanie bought a gun. Electronic toll records showed that she traveled to the Chesapeake Bay area on the suspected day of the murder. She admitted to moving her husband's car to a parking lot in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where it was found abandoned, but claimed she did so as a prank. In 2005, police finally had enough evidence to charge Melanie. Prosecutors accused her of drugging Bill with sedatives before shooting him and dismembering his body. Melanie's lawyer argued that Bill had mounting gambling debts and he was likely murdered by someone he owed money to. She continues to stand by this story from behind bars, where she's serving a life sentence for first-degree murder. Number 1. Julian Summers. After receiving a suspicious call one day in 2021, Memphis police found human remains inside a suitcase that was left next to a dumpster in an alleyway. The victim, identified as 63-year-old Bruce Jeffries, died from blunt force trauma to the head. Officers followed a trail of blood from the suitcase to the victim's apartment, where they arrested his roommate, 30-year-old Julian Summers. A witness reported seeing Summers struggling to dispose of the suitcase and leaving it on the ground when he couldn't lift it to throw it in the dumpster, and surveillance footage backed up these claims. During a search of the property, police found evidence of a struggle, including broken glass, a shattered mirror, and blood. It was evident that someone had tried to clean up the blood. Detectives also found a small suitcase matching the bigger one Jeffrey's body was found in. According to an affidavit, a relative of the victim told investigators that Summers and Jeffries had lived together for 2 years and were known to be in a domestic relationship. Summers faces charges for second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse.
Shimon Hayot. Shimon Hayot, or Simon Leviev, is an Israeli conman with a long history of theft, forgery, and fraud, dating back to 2011. Between 2017 and 2019, he met women through dating apps, borrowed money, then left them with the debts. Leviev lured new victims in by taking them on lavish first dates and pretending to be an heir to a multi-billion-dollar fortune. After establishing some trust, he told them some enemies were after him. He said he was unable to use his credit card for security reasons and convinced the women to open lines of credit and take loans out for him to use. When Leviev failed to pay them back, he used stalling tactics, harassment, and intimidation to get the girls off his case. By the time his crimes were exposed, he'd stolen over $10 million from his so-called girlfriends. In 2019, the Norwegian website VG published an expose called The Tinder Swindler. After the story broke, one of his victims, Eileen Coleman, pretended to feel sorry for Simon to gain his trust. She convinced him she could sell some of his designer clothes, but kept the money for herself, and her revenge didn't end there. While Leviev was on the run as a fugitive, Coleman told Interpol of his plans to fly to Greece. They were able to arrest him with this information. By then, he'd already done some prison time for frauding women. This time he was sentenced to 15 months. He was released after 5 months, but is still wanted in at least 4 countries. In a CNN interview in early 2022, Leviev denied being a con man and claimed he was just a single guy looking to meet women. He's been banned from several dating apps, and Tinder published new guidelines in light of the case to help users uncover scammers. 7. Andrew Burfield. In April 2022, a 33-year-old single mum from Lancashire, England named Katie Kenyon went missing after going on a picnic with her on and off-again boyfriend, 50-year-old Andrew Burfield. Her concerned family immediately pointed the finger at Burfield, who first told investigators that Katie went to rehab. He eventually cracked under pressure though and admitted she was dead, but that it was an accident. Burfield claimed Katie had dared him to try knocking a can of soda out of her hand with an axe. He said he reluctantly went along with the game and that the axe somehow hit Katie in the head. In the meantime, authorities searched for Katie's remains, but it was so well hidden that even a forensic archaeologist couldn't find it. Detectives finally convinced Burfield to take them to her body, and an autopsy revealed she was brutally bludgeoned to death from at least 12 strikes to the head. With this new information, Burfield was charged with murder. During his trial, it was revealed that Katie had been served with a court-ordered death notice for $5,240 a few months before her death. It was for money Burfield claimed she owed him, and despite Katie's best efforts to make a payment plan, Andrew pursued the case through the legal system. As Katie grew fearful that bailiffs would show up at her house and take her belongings, Burfield told the collection agency she had assets including a vehicle and a bicycle she bought for her son, and told them they could find her at home. At the same time, he told Katie that he loved her and encouraged her to check into a mental hospital. He even offered to pay for the stay. A month before the murder, Katie sent her mother a text message describing her lover as a Tinder swindler who conned her out of thousands of dollars and was now harassing her through the debt collection system. After months of maintaining innocence, Burfield changed his plea to guilty. He'll most likely be sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term that will be set by a judge sometime in late 2022. 6. Renan Augusto Gomez. 36-year-old Renan Augusto Gomez gained international notoriety as the so-called Brazilian Tinder swindler in 2022 after he scammed at least 7 women. He's accused of targeting wealthy girls between the ages of 34 and 40 through dating apps and preying on their sympathy with a sob story about being an orphan. The con man posed as an engineer and told his victims he was the son of German parents who died in a car accident. In his Tinder profile, he wrote that he was looking for a serious relationship and that women who weren't should skip his profile. He also claimed he'd been single for a year, while in reality he was seeing and scamming multiple women at a time. One alleged victim who works as a teacher claimed that Gomez stole over $28,000 from her. During the 4 months they dated, he convinced her to lend him money. Gomez told her and the other women he targeted that he owed back taxes and had some complicated financial problems with banks. Once they forked over the cash, he vanished without paying back a penny. Police started searching for Gomez in late 2021. They caught up with him 9 months later in Sao Paulo and arrested him after a short vehicle chase. Authorities believe there may be more victims and are waiting to see if anyone else comes forward with accusations. 5. Kelly Bryan. In early 2022, actress and singer Kelly Bryan shared her experience with a swindler on a British talk show called Loose Women. She described how she started dating a man who made a similar amount of money as her and said there were no financial issues between them at the start of the relationship. But he lost his job and she suddenly found herself fully supporting him. In Kelly's words, one thing led to another and before she knew it, she was knee-deep in a toxic relationship where the man controlled every aspect of her life despite her being the major breadwinner. She said he convinced her to give him her credit cards so he wouldn't feel emasculated by having to ask for money. Kelly realized she was being conned when her bank called to ask her about some suspicious transactions. She said the experience made her realize that a lot of people judge victims of con artists for not seeing the signs, but a person doesn't know how capable they are of being deceived until they've actually been in the situation. 4. Howard O'Keefer. For over a decade, Howard O'Keefer represented at least 16 criminal defendants in federal courts across the United States. He claimed to be specialized in the U.S. Bureau of Prisons policies, practices, and regulations. But he never actually went to law school, passed the bar exam, or graduated college. He also had an extensive criminal record, which includes convictions for grand theft, passing bad checks, and even stealing a cable TV. Kiefer somehow still managed to con the court into letting him act as a defense attorney and collected over $150,000 in client fees, as well as payments from the government before anyone realized what he was up to. He also attended prestigious conferences where he convinced other attendees he was qualified to practice law. Several attorneys even referred him to clients after hearing that he did a good job on similar cases in the past, and they also helped get Kiefer admitted to courts in districts throughout the country. Authorities finally wised up to the scheme in 2008 when an unhappy client reported his suspicion that Kiefer was a fraud. An investigation ensued, and one court after another realized they had no official records of Kiefer having a valid law license. It was also discovered that he never went to law school. Kiefer was soon disbarred and convicted of mail fraud and providing false statements. He was sentenced to 51 months in federal prison and was ordered to pay $120,000 in restitution. After being freed on supervised release, he allegedly broke the rules he was supposed to follow and flooded the courts with one appeal after another. The case continued for years, and in 2018 he was sentenced to 24 months in prison. 3. Antonio Marriott Wilson. The women who dated Antonio Marriott Wilson between 2015 and 2018 knew him as either Bryce Carrington or Dr. Tony Marriott. During that time, Wilson dated at least 4 women, including famous actress Jennifer Lewis, who starred in a sitcom called Blackish. He lied, saying he was a Navy SEAL, an Oxford graduate, a Bible scholar, and even a UCLA professor. Wilson also convinced girls he was an up-and-coming entrepreneur, and the big-name companies like ABC Television and EA Games had hired him as a software developer and audio engineer. He also claimed to have tens of millions worth of backing from high-profile investors. Believing Wilson's next big success was just around the corner, his unsuspecting girlfriends invested large amounts of money in businesses that were total shams. He used their money to finance his lavish lifestyle and pay bills, while cleverly hiding the fact that he had done prison time for fraud. By the time the law caught up with Wilson a second time, he'd conned his victims of $387,000. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and received an 8-year prison sentence, and was also ordered to pay $272,000 in restitution to 3 women who've not yet been paid back. The judge also banned him from using aliases on social media and professional networking sites in the future. In a victim impact statement, Lewis said it wasn't the fraud or the embarrassment of being swindled that hurt her the most, but the damage he did to her heart, the emotional impacts of his crimes, and the feeling of safety he took away from her. 2. Ramey Marston. In a shocking case of serial fraud that earned her the nickname of Seacoast Swindler, a New Hampshire woman named Ramey Marston made news headlines after hiring a live-in nanny in 2007 and stealing the victim's identity. The nanny moved out after a few months when her relationship with Marston crumbled. She soon discovered over $61,000 worth of unauthorized charges were made in her name during her employment. Marston was quickly convicted of felony fraud and received a 15-month prison sentence, but that was just the beginning. In 2009, she was arrested for bankruptcy fraud and writing bad checks. At the time, she was on house arrest for the nanny case. While out on bail in 2011, Marston started dating a man named Scott McCarthy. She convinced him to loan her almost $9,000 for rent and veterinary bills, and promised he would be repaid by her father, who she claimed was a high-profile gangster. When that never went through, McCarthy contacted Marston's probation officer. An investigation uncovered that she'd used the money to pay for a puppy, tea products, music downloads, furniture, hotel rooms, restaurant bills, a diamond ring, and more. Around the same time, Marston was accused of moving out of 2 rental properties she owed at least $11,000 in unpaid rent for. She wound up back in prison several times over the next few years for her criminal activity. Just 3 days after being released in 2018, Marston and her soon-to-be husband, a convicted bank robber named Robert Allen Peters, opened accounts with fraudulent checks at an Alabama bank. A few months later, Marston applied for a college loan using the name of a co-signer without that person's consent. She was convicted of bank fraud and aggravated identity theft in early 2022 and was sent back to prison for 54 months. 1. George Cameron. Between 2003 and 2015, a Burlington, New Jersey man named Leaford George Cameron fraudulently practiced law under a fake legal firm that went by several names, including Cameron and Associates, Cameron Hamilton and Associates, and Bernstein Cameron Hamilton and Associates. He collected over $200,000 in bogus fees from nearly 100 clients living in several states and India. He mostly represented people in immigration cases. Throughout the long-running scam, Cameron used at least 4 known attorney identification numbers belonging to real lawyers in Pennsylvania while filing legal paperwork. Authorities finally caught onto his scam in 2015 and charged him with mail fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements. It was the 3rd time Cameron had been caught impersonating an attorney, despite never being a lawyer. In fact, he was on probation for a previous conviction when he was arrested for the most recent case. Prosecutors accused him of providing substandard legal services to his victims, many of which were low-income clients who believed their money was paying for adequate representation. In one case, a client lost their home to foreclosure, and at least one other person was wrongfully deported thanks to Cameron's unqualified service. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and will be 77 years old when he's released. Hopefully by then he'll have different priorities and will avoid the con artist life. Thanks for watching. What would you do if someone tricked you into giving them thousands of dollars? Let me know in the comments below.